Hello, everybody. Brenna here from Mad Is It Bryn, and today's topic is one of my all-time favorite places to visit, located right here in Kentucky. Mammoth Cave, the world's longest known cave system. And while this cave system is a natural wonder, it also has some chilling history. So in this episode, we're going to discuss the documented deaths that haunt the Mammoth Cave. So, for those of you that don't know the story of Mammoth Cave, it became widely known to European Americans somewhere around 1797. The story goes that a hunter named John Houchin discovered the cave while chasing a bear. The cave has more than 400 miles of mapped passageways. Think about that for a second. 400 miles. And that's only the mapped areas. That does not include the areas that are still unexplored. So let's do a quick dive into the overall history of the cave before we get into the dark stuff. We're going to start with a timeline that can be found on the National Park Service website for Mammoth Cave. And we're going to begin in ancient times. Now, bear with me because this timeline is a lot. I didn't include all of it. I include stuff that I felt like was relevant and that also I felt like was cool. So some of it's not even relevant to the episode, but I thought it's relevant to history. Therefore, is it relevant to the episode? You decide. Or fast forward. I'm also going to put like a little screenshot of the actual timeline if you wish to pause. I might not even include the timeline. I don't know. We'll figure out when I edit. But I might include it, so I'm going to go ahead and read it now. And I'm going to read it quickly because this episode is a lot. We have a lot of history to cover. So let's begin. We're going to start off strong at 325 million BCE. Prehistoric seas of the Mississippian era deposited layers of limestone in what would eventually become Kentucky. 10 million BCE, rainwater begins dissolving the limestone to form the first passages of Mammoth Cave. And now we're going to make a big jump in history to the 1770s. In 1775, Daniel Boone cuts the Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. Also, in 1775, the American Revolutionary War begins. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence is signed. Moving on to the 1780s. In 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States of America. Also, in 1789, the United States Constitution was written. All right, now we're moving on to 1790s. In the year 1790, John Houchin moves from Virginia and settles on the Green River near the cave. Legends suggest this early settler became the first European to find the cave. In 1792, Kentucky statehood. Also in 1792, many Kentucky settlers manufacture their own gunpowder from nitrate found in cave dirt. In 1798, Valentine Simmons buys 200 acres of land containing 2 saltpeter caves. In 1799, Simon sells the 200 acres and the 2 caves to John Flatt. The larger cave became known as Flatt's Cave. Then Flatt sells the property to John McLean and his 2 brothers. We're already in the 1800s. See, we're moving pretty quick. 1808, McLean brothers sell Flatt's Cave to Fleming Gatewood and Charles Wilkins. In 1810, the first published use of the name Mammoth Cave was used in a Richmond, Virginia newspaper. In 1812, the declaration of war with England, starting what would later be known as the War of 1812, began. Also in 1812, Gatewood sells his interest in Mammoth Cave to Hyman Gratz of Philadelphia. In 1813, the mummy known as Fawnhoof is found in Short Cave and taken to Mammoth Cave for display. You did hear me correctly, and believe me, we will be covering that topic in this episode. In 1813 to 1814, enslaved men mined vast amounts of saltpeter at Mammoth Cave, and they sent it to gunpowder factories in the East to supply American military war efforts, including fighting the British during the War of 1812. In 1815, saltpeter operation ceases. Nahum Ward makes a trip into Mammoth Cave, draws a new cave map, and writes long descriptions about the cave and long descriptions about the mummy. His writings will end up making Mammoth Cave famous. In 1816, we have what is known as the first known tour of Mammoth Cave. In 1830, Bell's Tavern is built. In 1834, George S. Gatewood, which was the manager of Mammoth Cave, allows Jesse Sutton to hold religious services in the cave at a site later known as Methodist Church. I feel like this is taking forever for me to go through, but maybe it's not as bad for you guys. Or maybe it is. We'll find out on this week's episode. I'm sorry about that. Okay. In 1835, Edmund F. Lee makes an instrument survey and map showing 8 miles of Mammoth Cave and publishes his guidebook, Notes on Mammoth Cave. In 1838, Wandering Willie walks from Cincinnati to Mammoth Cave and he spends a night in the cave. Say that 5 times fast. I won't. I'm going to try. Wandering Willie walks. Wandering Willie walks. It's actually not that hard. It's not that hard. Moving on. In 1838, Charles F. Harvey is lost in the cave for 39 hours. Can you imagine? 39 hours in the dark. So you probably don't have a lantern. He might have had a lantern. I don't know. Also in 1838, Franklin Gorwin and A. Harvey purchased Mammoth Cave and 1,600 acres from Kyman and Simon Gratz. Gorwin enlarges and improves the Mammoth Cave Inn and hires Archibald Miller Jr. as manager. Stephen Bishop, an enslaved man who will later be known as the Sable Genius, becomes a cave guide. In 1841, Dr. Krogan builds 2 huts in Audubon Avenue for use by tuberculosis patients. In May of 1842, tuberculosis patient Dr. William J. Mitchell enters Mammoth Cave, the first of 10. Some die in the cave, and all ultimately perish. The last patient leaves the cave in 1843. The experiment shows that the cave air does not cure tuberculosis. In 1849, Dr. Krogan dies. Mammoth Cave is placed in a trust known as the Mammoth Cave Estate, and this trust owns and manages the cave until 1920. In 1856, Stephen Bishop is given his freedom, but he chooses to remain at Mammoth Cave. In 1857, Stephen Bishop dies in July. Matt and Nick Bransford remain as the principal guides. In 1875, Bill Cutliff and Tom Lee discover the Little Alice mummy in Salt's Cave. The mummy is displayed in Long Cave and then in Mammoth Cave until the 1950s, where it is called the Mammoth Cave Mummy and later named Little Al. In 1880, the Jesse James Gang robs the Mammoth Cave stagecoach on September 3rd. All right, now we're getting into the 1900s. We're almost there, I swear. Are we, though? Because I don't remember the script that I wrote. So are we almost there? In the year 1900, Curtis G. Lloyd of Cincinnati is lost in the Corkscrew for 12 tours. Guides Bob McDaniel and Jason Nelson find him. An inscription Lloyd left on the cave wall reads, "It is hell to be lost." In 1922, Floyd Collins discovers a mile-long passage in Crystal Cave, later named the Floyd's Lost Passage. In 1925, Floyd Collins becomes trapped in Sand Cave. Rescuers extricated him on February 16th, but he had died perhaps 3 days earlier. In 1935, guides Grover Campbell and Lyman Cutliff discover the Lost John mummy. In 1941, Mammoth Cave National Park is established on July 1st with 45,310 acres. I feel like that timeline was a lot, but maybe it was to me because I had to reread it a lot. So to preface this, we're not only covering the dark history in this episode, we're covering the history in general. But believe me when I say that history does get pretty dark in some parts. To begin, let's get into a little bit more detail about the history of humans inhabiting Mammoth Cave. And in order to do that, we're going to have to travel back in time. 12,000 years ago. Not that far back. All right, coming to you directly from the Mammoth Cave website. There were prehistoric people from the late Archaic and early woodland periods that once inhabited the forests and plains of Kentucky, with a focus on the river valleys and their abundant resources. Their hunter-gatherer lifestyle eventually led them to discover Mammoth Cave thousands of years before the arrival of European settlers. Around 1200 BCE, the passageways of Mammoth Cave were being mined by these prehistoric people. They were mining minerals like gypsum, epsomite, and mirabilite. We aren't entirely sure what these minerals were being mined for. They are highly soluble and do not hold up well outside of the dry cave environment. Archaeologists who specialize in the study of cave artifacts do have their theories, though, and they think they could have been used in medicine, perhaps in trade, ritual activity, or maybe even for agricultural purposes. These prehistoric people would use mussel shells that they had gathered from the Green River, and they would scrape the minerals off of the walls into baskets or whatever they had handy to carry back to their destinations. They have found so many artifacts throughout the cave to give us context clues as to what their activities might have been during this time period. For example, fragments of river cane torch, like the one seen in this image here, because of course it was pitch black in that cave. So during cave tours, they will have you turn off lanterns, phone lights, everything essentially, and just sit in the dark in the silence to experience what it might have been like for people entering the cave back in the day. And it is very scary, to say the least. Like, could you imagine getting lost in the cave system and then your torch goes out? Like, how are you going to get out? How? You're not? Really, how would you get out? Leave it. Comment. Comment if you think you could figure out a way to get out. I don't think you could. I feel like if your torch goes out, you're donezo. Zip. Kaboom. That's the end of you. But we are going to dive into that a little further into the episode because unfortunately, that has happened. Anyways, where were we? Artifacts. They found artifacts like the cane torch we mentioned previously. They found bowls made out of gourd, woven fibers, sandals, and petroglyphs and pictographs. Brenna, what are petroglyphs and pictographs? That's you. You asked me that. Well, if you must know, petroglyphs are carved line glyphs. They are created by pecking, scraping away, incising the stone to show a lighter color of unweathered rock underneath. Pictographs are charcoal pigment drawn glyphs. They can also be drawn using clay or other materials. These prehistoric people were also explorers. Well, I guess that would be obvious, but they didn't just casually enter the cave and mine. They explored the upper 3 levels and found 19 miles of passages. Again, like 19 miles. That is a lot of exploring. And the exploring didn't just stop there. So fast forward to the early 1800s, explorers literally risked everything to chart the cave's massive tunnel system. News of this massive cave attracted visitors. So with visitors, you have guides. Keep in mind that during this time, there were no lights. Mammoth Cave is dark. And like I mentioned previously, if you go and visit Mammoth Cave today, there is a point in time during some of the tours where they will ask you to turn all of your lights off so that you can experience what it would have been like to be lost in the cave. Like I said, it's scary. It's so quiet that all you hear is the sound of your own heartbeat. You can't even see your hand in front of your face. It's scary. And this is during a time where the cave is mapped out, like for your safety, and the paths are illuminated. The thought of guided tours in the early 1800s, it's a disaster waiting to happen. Thomas Edison didn't even invent the light bulb until 1879, and it wasn't installed in Mammoth Cave until 38 years later in 1917. The first known cave tour of Mammoth Cave was in 1816. So just sit and think about that for a minute. These explorers and guides were risking their lives every single time they entered the cave. Some of them were lost forever. Others died from suffocation or from falls. Of course, these deaths were not formally recorded. I would also like to add that some of these cave guides were enslaved African Americans. These enslaved men mined vast amounts of saltpeter at Mammoth Cave and would send it to gunpowder factories in the East to supply American war efforts, including fighting the British during the War of 1812. An enslaved African American guide by the name of Stephen Bishop was one of the most important early explorers of Mammoth Cave, and he contributed hugely in understanding the cave system. He created the first accurate map in 1842. It was a hand-drawn map that was incredibly precise and was used for decades. He also explored unknown sections of the cave and was one of the first people to cross the dangerous underground river in Mammoth Cave known as the River Styx. If you've ever been to Mammoth Cave and you have taken the tour that includes walking through, quote, Fat Man's Misery, that passage was named by Stephen Bishop. He was one of the most knowledgeable cave explorers of his time. He was emancipated in 1856. Him and his wife Charlotte and their son Thomas moved to a 75-acre tract of land near the cave property that year. Stephen remained as a paid guide at Mammoth Cave until his death. Though his cause of death is not documented, there is a monument at Mammoth Cave National Park that honors his contributions. He referred to Mammoth Cave as a grand, gloomy, and a peculiar place. And I think that description fits the cave perfectly. Matterson Matt Bransford was another famous enslaved guide at Mammoth Cave during the 1800s. He was the first of 5 generations of Bransfords to guide tours inside Mammoth Cave. Matt was biracial, born in 1815 to an enslaved woman and her enslaver, Thomas Bransford. He was leased to Thomas's business partner in 1838, Franklin Gorwin, owner and manager of Mammoth Cave. He worked alongside Stephen Bishop, Nick Bransford, and Alfred Krogan, leading tours to white tourists. He married an enslaved woman by the name of Parthena, who lived 2 miles from Mammoth Cave, and then they had children together. It was there that he built a home for his family. But even though Matt had a positive reputation for himself in the community, that couldn't protect him and his family. 3 of his 4 children were sold and taken away from them. He remained at Mammoth Cave for the entirety of his life. He was guiding tours in his 70s. He said about the cave, "It seems most like a child now. We've been together for so long." Matt and Parthena's son Henry also became a guide at Mammoth Cave. Henry, along with his parents, gained their freedom in the 1860s. He married his wife Alice and had 6 children. 2 of his children went on to be the 3rd generation to work as guides at Mammoth Cave, Matt Bransford and Louis Bransford. He passed away from a heart attack in 1894 at only 45 years old. While slavery was abolished, tours were still very strictly segregated, along with lodging, leaving very little options for black visitors. Henry's son Matt, alongside his wife Zimmy, owned and operated a 2-story, 14-room hotel for black visitors at Mammoth Cave called the Bransford Summer Resort. Matt led specialty tours to black visitors. When the process of creating Mammoth Cave National Park began in the 1920s, Matt and Zimmy sold their hotel and property for $3,000, which was way under market value for the amount of acres that they were giving up. They moved around 20 miles away, and then they raised their son, David. Moving from the 1800s to the 1900s, a man by the name of Curtis G. Lloyd became lost in the corkscrew for 12 hours. For those of you that don't know, the corkscrew refers to a famous section of the cave system that is known for its tight, twisting, and spiraling passage, similar to the shape of a corkscrew, which sounds horrific. Curtis was an American scientist known for his work in mycology, which is the study of fungi. He also became known for the exploration and mapping of caves in the late 19th century. He was found by guides Bob McDaniel and John Nelson, with an inscription written on the cave walls that said, "It is hell to be lost." Valid. Very valid. Now I'm going to introduce you to Floyd Collins. Floyd was born July 20th, 1887 in Logan County, Kentucky. He was a renowned cave explorer. He discovered Crystal Cave in 1917 beneath his father's farmland, and he turned it into a tourist attraction. He discovered a mile-long passage in Crystal Cave in 1922, which was later named Floyd's Lost Passage. This man was very good at what he did. During the time period that Floyd was exploring, cave tourism was getting crazy. And when I say crazy, I mean business was booming and therefore extremely competitive. They call this era the Cave Wars. But Floyd had a problem. The Great Crystal Cave wasn't making much profit, if any. It was located in a very remote location on Flint Ridge Road. In order to get to this location, you had to pass by other show caves on the way. So, of course, people would stop at those caves instead, and they rarely made it back to Crystal Cave. But Floyd knew about another potential cave show location on a different property that was owned by a man named Beasley Doyle. It was located right beside Cave City Road, the perfect location. They called it Sand Cave. He tried to strike a deal with Beasley, saying that he would split the profits with him if they were successful at making it a show cave. Now we're going to fast forward to January 30th, 1925. Floyd enters the cave with a kerosene lantern and a dream. He began exploring, squeezing through different passages, some so tight that he was having to inch through on his stomach with one arm stretched above him and one arm tucked underneath him. That is horrifying in itself. So he's crawling through these tight passages, pushing his lantern with one hand ahead of him, and he sees the cave begin to open up. But then he runs into an issue. His lantern is flickering. This is the only lantern that Floyd has, his only light source. This is a new cave to Floyd that he's not familiar with. But even aside from that, losing your light source, even in a cave that you are familiar with, is dangerous. Floyd knew this, and even though he didn't want to turn back, he did. It was on this journey back that Floyd became trapped. While crawling back through the tight space, he accidentally moved a 27-pound rock with his foot. When it fell, it wedged his ankle to the point that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move his foot. He is then trapped 60 feet below the surface. After it was discovered that Floyd was trapped, there were rescue attempts made. We're talking engineers, geologists, cavers, anyone that could potentially help, they were there. After the initial attempts failed, miners began digging a shaft to try to get to him, all day and night for multiple days. He was brought food and water for 4 days until a rock collapsed in the entryway, leaving him stranded with no interaction other than voice contact. On the 18th day of Floyd's entrapment, they finally reached him from a 55-foot vertical shaft. But this isn't a happy ending. Floyd was dead due to exposure. Sand Cave was sealed with Floyd's remains inside. It would be months later before Floyd's body was removed so a proper burial could take place. Floyd was later laid to rest in Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery. If you are interested in a more in-depth coverage of Floyd Collins' case, I do have an episode that goes into much greater detail and covers the events that took place every day, all day, for all 18 days of Floyd's rescue mission. This case made national news. It became a tourist attraction. There were booths and vendors outside the cave. Journalists were coming to the cave to interview Floyd, like the notable William Burke Miller, also known as Skeets Miller. People were fighting over which method to attempt to get Floyd out. It was a huge ordeal. So if that is something that you would like to learn more about, that video will come out probably in a week or so after this one, or maybe it's already out by the time you're watching this. So be sure to subscribe to my channel to find out if you want to, if you're curious about more. You already know how it ends, but it is a pretty wild story as to how it got there. Yeah, Floyd's case is very tragic, and it does deserve an episode all on its own. If I were to cover Floyd's case in this episode would be like 3 hours long, and who knows how long it already is now. Now, moving on. The next thing that we are going to talk about is the famous tuberculosis huts. Yeah, we have to skip back in time for this one. In 1839, Franklin Gorin sold Mammoth Cave, along with 1,610 acres, to Dr. John Croghan for $10,000. Dr. Croghan was a man from Louisville, Kentucky, who suffered from tuberculosis himself. Visitors and miners who had entered the cave previously apparently reported feeling better than before after spending time in the cave, which gave Dr. Croghan an idea. Dr. Croghan believed that the uniform temperatures and humidity would help to cure the patients. He also had observed that timber and animals didn't decay inside the cave, leading him to think that the environment would be restorative. I see where he got this way of thinking, because the cave environment it's very dry, stable, and has low bacteria. I guess I get it. During this time period, there was very little medical knowledge of treatments for tuberculosis, also called the White Plague. In 1841, Dr. Croghan would have huts built in Audubon Avenue to be used by tuberculosis patients. They were essentially stone cabins, along with 8 wooden structures that were also built that measured 12 by 18 feet, with tongue and groove flooring and canvas roofs. The first patient, Dr. William J. Mitchell, would enter the cave in May of 1842. In the winter of 1842, Dr. Croghan invited 16 people to live under his care inside the cave. At first, they actually were showing signs of improvement. Dr. Croghan got so excited that he thought he might as well have plans drawn up for a hotel to be created inside the cave. But then, as winter continued along, everyone kind of took a turn for the worse. The cave was dark and damp, not ideal. And then on top of that, you've got all the smoke and ash being inhaled from the lanterns that they were using as light sources. Their lungs are already severely damaged, and of course, that would worsen them. These patients had no access to natural light and had to sync up their watches to have any idea of what time it was to keep up with their daily routines. There were cedar trees and other plants like bushes brought in to try to relieve some of the gloominess from inside the cave. But of course, with no light source, The plants all died. Cooking did happen occasionally inside the cave, but the majority of the meals were prepared by enslaved individuals and brought to the patients. One of the gentlemen who brought them food, named Alfred, was quoted saying, "I used to stand on that rock and blow the horn to call them to dinner. There were 15 of them, and they looked more like a company of skeletons than anything else." So, as previously discussed, we know that tours began in Mammoth Cave in 1816. Tourism continued to grow throughout the years. Obviously, look at Mammoth Cave today. But the hotel that was already at Mammoth Cave, but not located within the cave, was going through some remodeling and expansions, as well as new roads being built on by Dr. Krogan's orders. The tourists were still touring the cave while these patients were in their tuberculosis huts. Which, could you imagine being these patients coughing in your damp, cold home, and then you look over and see people walking by, taking tours, staring at you? Anyways, one of the patients by the name of H.P. Anderson wrote, "There are many things to be done to render this place entirely pleasant and to give its virtues a fair test. We are pioneers under all disadvantages of such, and after generations will reap the benefits of our experiments." Anderson was actually the only person to leave the cave and return to the surface after there were complaints from the patients and they were making requests to leave. Dr. Krogan did convince the others to stay, though. The weeks passed, and 5 patients passed away inside the cave. Their bodies were put on a rock that is now called Corpse Rock. After these 5 patients passed away, Dr. Krogan decided it was finally time to throw in the towel and return to the surface again. The experiment was short-lived and only lasted around 5 months, from fall of 1842 to the early months of 1843. He did not try to repeat this experiment and took it for what it was, a failure. All of the remaining patients eventually died from tuberculosis, as well as Dr. Krogan. He passed away in 1849. The wooden framed huts were taken apart inside the cave, but the stone huts remain, and they can be viewed if you take a tour of the Broadway in the Mammoth Cave Historic District. The tuberculosis experiment was not the only experiment performed on people in Mammoth Cave. Shocking? I know. Not shocking. So now we're going to fast forward roughly 100 years to 1938 in order to discuss the Mammoth Cave sleep study. During this sleep study, researchers from the University of Chicago went deep into Mammoth Cave to conduct a sleep study that would end up being pretty groundbreaking when it comes to the science of sleep. Dr. Nathaniel Kleitman and his graduate student Bruce Richardson, who were both sleep scientists, conducted an experiment to study the fluctuations of wakefulness and body temperature, according to the National Park Service website. The goal of the experiment was to understand how the absence of a natural light-dark cycle influenced mental performance and biological rhythms. This study lasted a month. Instead of the typical 24 hours in a day's cycle, they were going to attempt to adjust their internal clocks to 28 hours a day instead. Dr. Kleitman and Bruce would stay in Rafinsky Hall, which is a large cave passageway that's near the historic entrance. They would record everything they did throughout the day, especially taking notes on how well their bodies were reacting to the new environmental conditions without sunlight and how it was affecting their body's circadian rhythm. Of course, this study was not without its issues. They're conducting it inside of a cave. There was no clean drinking water inside the cave, so that had to be brought in, as well as food for them to eat, not to mention it was only the 2 of them inside of it, so communication with the outside world was rather scarce. They were able to get help with these necessities from the staff that were at the Mammoth Cave Hotel. They even had their mail delivered to them in the cave, which is interesting. It makes sense. And I'm sure some of you are wondering by now, how are they not freezing in that cave? On average, the temperature inside Mammoth Cave consistently hovers around 54 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, or 12 to 13 degrees Celsius year-round. That is not exactly a comfortable temperature. While these stable temperatures are perfect for experiments, they are not ideal for the human body. These researchers had to wear multiple layers of clothing, layer upon layer, and then on top of that, they also wore really heavy coats. Bruce Richardson, which was the graduate student, would say, I guessed we missed hot baths more than anything else. Love a good hot bath. That's neither here nor there. So, for those curious about the scientific details pertaining to this experiment, the way that they were able to track their circadian rhythms was by logging how their body temperature changed. They found that body temperature fluctuates during the day and has a direct impact on physical performance and cognitive ability, especially saying that your peak efficiency during the day was usually when you were at your peak body temperature. Something else that is interesting about this study is that the two men had different responses. Bruce was only 25 years old. He was able to adapt easier to the 28-hour sleep wake cycle than Dr. Kleitman was. Dr. Kleitman was 43 years old. The doctor remained within the 24-hour cycle. This displayed a potential for younger people to more easily acclimate to drastic changes in the environment than someone who is older. Dr. Kleitman said it merely shows what has been known a long time, that some individuals can change their habits with ease, while others find it very difficult to do so. I feel that. Overall, this sleep study showed us the ways that our bodies react to environmental cues without conventional markers of time, like the sun, for example. Yep, pretty interesting. So, next up on our interesting journey through the history of Mammoth Cave, we're going to talk about the mummies. Yes, plural, mummies. Now, when discussing the quote, mummies of Mammoth Cave, I do feel like it is important for me to add that not all of the mummies associated with Mammoth Cave were actually found at Mammoth Cave. For the purposes of this video, we are going to be discussing a few specific mummies. We're not going to cover all of them. What is true and what has been embellished is a little hard to differentiate because there's just so little information out there about this, but we will do the best that we can. First, we're going to travel back in time to the early months of the War of 1812. Contrary to popular belief, the first mummy I'm going to discuss was not actually found inside Mammoth Cave. She was found in the entrance of Short Cave. Short Cave is still located within Mammoth Cave National Park, but it is a completely separate cave located about 8 miles from the Mammoth Cave historical entrance. So, the story goes that there was a miner working in the cave, and when he struck the ground with his shovel, he heard the sound of something hollow underneath him. After removing rocks and clay, he eventually was able to dig out what he discovered to be a 4-foot by 4-foot crypt. Inside that crypt were the remains of an ancient Native American woman who would come to be called Fawn Hoof. She was allegedly named this because of a necklace found in her crypt that had young deer hooves strung on it. Some reports say that her wrists were wrapped with a cord, while other reports dispute this. So do with that what you will. She was extremely well preserved, and while we don't exactly know much about Fawn Hoof, she is believed to be an elderly woman who was most likely a respected member of her time. She was estimated to have been around 6 feet tall. Her hair was cut short and appeared to have been a dark auburn or red color. Her teeth and her nails were in almost perfect condition. During the time of her discovery, when Charles Wilkins owned Mammoth Cave still, he wrote, quote, found at a depth of 10 feet from the surface of the cave in a sitting position, encased in broad stones, standing on their edges with a flat stone covering the hole. It was enveloped in coarse clothes, wrapped in deer skins, enclosed in the stone coffin were the working utensils, beads, feathers, and other ornaments of dress which belonged to her. End quote. So keep in mind while I'm discussing these mummies that sometimes the stuff that I'm going to be saying is varying a little bit because the sources vary a lot. And it is hard for me to differentiate between what is accurate and what is not. There's really not that many sources in general. But moving on. According to GreatAmericanHikes.com, Fawn Hoof had, quote, evidence of 2 wounds emerged upon inspection, one between ribs near the backbone and an injured eye. Her skin was dark and hardened to her bones. Further examination revealed her weight at 14 pounds and her height to be 5'10", an uncommon height for a woman of her time. Beside her lay moccasins, a knapsack, and another bag made from inner tree bark fibers. Within the knapsack and second bag resided a treasure trove of ancient artifacts. These included a woven head cap, 7 ornate headdresses crafted from large bird feathers, hundreds of brown bead strings, a necklace with 20 red fawn hoofs, an eagle claw pendant, a bear jaw pendant, 2 rattlesnake skins, one with 14 rattles in it, numerous bunches of threads and twine, 7 needles made of horn and bone, 2 bundled cane whistles, and more. End quote. When she was first discovered, the miner told Mammoth Cave's manager, Archibald Miller, about his discovery. Her body was removed from Short Cave and relocated to the large room inside the natural entrance of Mammoth Cave that is known as the Rotunda. This did not sit well with the enslaved African American workers that were in the cave mining saltpeter. They were superstitious about the remains, and they were in the rotunda every day for work, so it's understandable why they would feel uneasy with human remains beside them. The miners then went on strike until the remains were moved. Fawnhoof was then moved by the owners of the cave to an upper level passage called Gothic Avenue, and she was placed on a ledge, which is now known as Mummy's Seat. You can still view this ledge today if you take the Gothic Avenue tour. However, the mummy will not be there, of course. In 1815, a man by the name of Nahum Ward saw the remains while touring Mammoth Cave and petitioned the American Antiquarian Society, also known as AAS, in Worcester to procure the ancient remains. He was a businessman and wealthy landowner who was originally from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, but eventually moved to Marietta, Ohio. He claimed he wanted the remains to be protected in the museum's holdings. He was a liar, allegedly. Instead of protecting the remains, he just kept them and then included them in his traveling expedition while touring the country. Yeah. He rented a springboard wagon and first took Fawnhoof to Lexington, Kentucky. She became very popular here through exhibitions, but Mr. Ward didn't stop there. No, he kept going. He took her to Cincinnati, Marietta, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. For the low price of 25 cents, you too could view Fawnhoof. Well, not now. Your ancestors could view Fawnhoof. So, of course, this caused Fawnhoof's remains to deteriorate even more, obviously. Why can't we just let the dead rest? Eventually, Fawnhoof's remains were passed on to the American Antiquarian Society. They were on exhibit at the World's Fairs of 1876 and 1893. She was called the Mammoth Cave Mummy. The remains traveled again in 1876 to the Smithsonian Institution, which is where they are right now. Her remains are not currently on display for what is said to be for preservation purposes. Her remains were dismembered and are being stored in a box in the museum's collection under accession number 4789, allegedly. I cannot confirm the exact placement for sure, but the Smithsonian Museum has her remains and they are being stored. The next mummy we are going to discuss was originally called Little Alice. In 1875, 2 men by the names of Bill Cutliff and Tom Lee discovered Little Alice in salt caves. Legend says that for Little Alice, the mummy was found at around 9,000 feet. This mummy was rather small, only 3.5 feet tall, and what is unique about Little Alice is that they were originally thought to be a girl, but it was later discovered that Little Alice was in fact a boy that had not yet hit puberty. The mummy was renamed Little Al. According to the Archaeology of Mummy Valley Salt Caves, Mammoth Cave National Park, Kentucky, forensic investigations suggested that the boy was mortally wounded while mining cave minerals. His death resulted from an internal hemorrhage and apparently occurred inside the cave. Carbon dating estimated the mummy to be around 3,000 to 4,000 years old. Now, while I cannot find many sources on Little Al, GreatAmericanHikes.com did have a lot of information on the mummy. Actually, they had an entire article about all of the Mammoth Cave mummies, which I do recommend checking out for those curious. The article states that the mummy was stolen from salt caves and sold to Larkin Proctor. Larkin Proctor was the owner of Grand Avenue Cave, which was then called Wright's Cave or Long Cave during that time period. So Little Al was stolen by 2 Lee brothers and William Cutliff, then sold for $85, supposedly. Allegedly. Then Larkin Proctor told everyone that he had found this mummy inside of his cave. Many people were skeptical about this discovery. There was a newspaper editor by the name of Samuel Young that published his thoughts, stating that the mummy was indeed stolen from Salt's Cave. Little Al remained on display for all to see for 15 more years. He was then sold to Henry Ganter, Mammoth Cave Hotel and Caves manager. The mummy apparently went in between Mammoth Cave and Henry's barn when it wasn't on display. Then a man named George Morrison opened a new cave entrance, named it, quote, New Entrance to Mammoth Cave, end quote. Henry had introduced George to Little Al. George had a little bit of a rivalry going on with the other entrance to Mammoth Cave, which is now called the Historic Entrance for those curious. So he put Little Al on display in his section to draw attention there. He called her the Lady of the Cave, which not her, he called the Lady of the Cave, but it wasn't until 1958 that Little Al was taken to the University of Kentucky's anthropology department, where he had a detailed examination take place. And during this examination, Dr. Louise Robbins discovered that little Alice was, in fact, a little boy. The mummy's whereabouts are now at the University of Kentucky for safekeeping. Next on our list is the mummy known as Lost John. The year is 1935. A group of men who worked for the CCC, also known as the Civilian Conservation Corps, were out exploring a steep ledge in a location that was about 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers from the historic entrance of Mammoth Cave. It was on this ledge that the men found who we now call Lost John. He is an ancient Native American who was most likely mining gypsum inside the cave before he was trapped beneath a large boulder. According to the National Park Service website, it seemed like Lost John had been laying underneath the boulder with his back to the ground and had somehow dislodged it, causing the boulder to fall on top of him and trap him. He remained in this location for thousands of years before his remains were moved, studied, and then, of course, put on display on the route of the historic tour. He would remain on display for decades, but in the 1970s, he was removed from display because obviously it's inappropriate. People wanted him to be put to rest, rightfully so. Lost John's remains are now in a secret cave location in Mammoth Cave where the public has no access to. There are also other mummies that you will see when researching the mummies of Mammoth Cave. There is one referred to as the baby mummy. I could not find mention of this particular mummy on the National Park Service website. I did find information on other websites, but I cannot confirm if that information is accurate or not, so I didn't want to go into a lot of detail in this episode. Baby mummy is described as being 9 to 12 months old. There is also a mummy called the Scudder mummy that was supposedly found in 1814. But again, I cannot find enough information about these mummies to justify putting them in the episode in great detail because I cannot confirm their existence. With that, I will say that this video is probably long enough. Yes, Mammoth Cave is stunning, but it does have a history of danger and death. So, with that being said, when are you planning your visit? I will say that I have been to Mammoth Cave many times, and I will never turn down an opportunity to go back. I do love Mammoth Cave, even if it does kind of give you the heebie-jeebies when you walk through it a little bit. All right, so tune into my next video where I go into extensive detail on Floyd Collins and what transpired in the 18 days that he was trapped inside Sand Cave. And if you're feeling froggy, like, subscribe, comment, and all of that good stuff, I would greatly appreciate it because I do put a lot of time into researching these episodes. I didn't really get to be funny in this episode. Not saying that I'm funny, but this episode's not a funny episode. So I can't like hee and ha ha with you guys when we're talking about serious stuff. So next episode won't be funny either. But maybe the next one, if you subscribe, you'll find out. Thanks for watching.